Now, what I'm going to do today, I think I'm just going to work on. I'll do a little bit of sculpting on this guy's beard, just to give you an idea of how kind of the facial resculpting thing works. And then I'm going to do one of his legs and his boots as well, trouser legs and boots, just to kind of show you how just some basic clothing sculpting. And I think I'll start off with with his leg. And I always mix them separate to start, and then I mix the two parts together. One thing to remember with this Duro putty or Knead-A-Tight, you don't need to mix them in equal portions. You can see here I've got maybe a third as much blue as I've got yellow. They'll dry in virtually any combination. The more blue you put in, the stickier it is and the harder it is to work with. The more yellow you put in, the softer and more supple it is. Now, you don't want it to be too soft and too supple, but you certainly don't want it to be too sticky either. So
they're basically 50-50s, aren't they? I mean,
yeah,
but
they don't need to be 50-50 to dry.
That's when it really gets sticky.
It used to be a lot of the epoxy products, if you weren't within a tenth of a percent, 50-50, they wouldn't dry.
Yeah.
That's not the case here. This basically, the blue just causes a reaction which causes it to dry. It'll dry a little slower if you have less blue in there, but it'll still dry. And in any event, I usually
determine your open time for working by the amount of, we'll say, blue that you put.
Exactly, but usually with this, because I'm usually using the straight putty. Let me pass that around. I'll pass around a chunk of that. You guys just want to kind of get an idea of what it feels like. When this has got a little bit of stickiness to it, it'll adhere to the figure really well. If you're putting on a whole bunch of buttons, let's say you're doing a whole bunch of buttons down the front of a uniform, after you've done about maybe 10 or 12 of them, the next few might not stick so easily. They might tend to want to fall off because it starts to lose just enough of its adhesion that you'll have a little trouble with it. It'll stay workable for well over an hour, though, for most purposes. But again, this is really, really useful putty for this kind of application. Now, the A and B putty, when I pass this around, is a lot stickier, and heavier generally than the Duro is. That's probably close enough. And this one I do mix 50-50. The A and B you need to stick pretty darn close to 50. That's good. You need to keep this pretty close to 50-50.
Do you have to seal those tubes up in between time, or?
Yeah. But they do get a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. I used to use so much putty. I used to make so many models. I never had to worry that they were always gone before anything had a chance to dry out. Now I'm not quite as fast as I was when I was younger. So yeah, you're probbe right. I need to do that.
Yeah, seal it in a grip lock back up.
Yeah. I keep waiting for my staff to seal them up, but I don't have a staff. So.
I noticed with the A and B, it also seems to be more water workable. I was able to kind of smooth it over.
Well, that's another thing. I did bring this, but I forgot to bring a brush. I'm probably not going to really need that, but you can use a paintbrush to smooth out areas in this. I find that when you use straight Duro or you use Duro mixed with A and B, you can brush them really easy if you want to. But you got to be careful because you don't want the whole thing to just be a bunch of subtle rolling brushed, lumps. You want some crispness in some of your folds and creasing too. So you got to be careful not to overdo the brushing. You can kind of fall in love with that and just brush all the detail right out of it. So it's one of those things you have to be careful of. Now, when I'm going to start with this right leg because I think it's a little more interesting than the left one. And I generally do my trouser legs in two parts. I generally do one, then the other. And keep in mind now when I'm doing this guy's going to have a taller pair of boots that come about knee high, as you can see from the picture here. I'm just going to lay these out so everybody can kind of look at them. But he's got a fairly standard, Civil War riding boot. It's comes up just below the knee, about maybe mid to upper calf, and and then it's got a little half moon shaped piece, kind of a half moon knee guard that kind of sticks out a little bit away from the body. Pretty standard. I mean, these are boots that seem like Civil War officers must have all gone to Boots R Us or something to get all their boots. They're all very, very similar. They all have, you'll see subtle variations, but they basically follow the same design. So you see, I'm using a little bit of saliva here just to kind of smooth this out here, just to get it to cover. My first objective here when I'm putting putty on, and I'm using kind of a rolling motion just to get it spread, is I'm trying to make sure I get on the right amount. This is when I see people who are getting into sculpting for the first time, probably one of the areas that probably takes the longest to learn is just how much putty to put on. I see a lot of guys who don't put enough or put too much, and don't know where that happy medium is, that right amount. I got a little lump on here that I got to clean off. A lot of people I know use things like dental tools and all kinds of other objects for sculpting. Mike Good gave a demonstration at SCAMS probably 20 years ago, and he brought in these toothpicks that he had sanded down to different shapes, and then he'd coated them with super glue. Just dipped them into a little puddle of super glue and spun them, let them dry, then sanded them lightly off, and then put another coat on. And essentially you create a plastic coating on them. And the beauty of this is they don't cost anything, and you can make them any shape you want. If you lose one, it just takes a minute to make another one. So it's a pretty functional thing, and also I find it very comfortable to use in my hand as well. People have given me other sculpting tools over the years, and I've always thanked them very politely, and they go into a drawer. And
You're using a rolling motion with a toothpick?
yeah, right now I'm just trying to get it spread, and the main thing is I'm trying to get the amount of putty on the leg that I want, and I'm trying to get it in essentially the right places. And I'm only going to go down just below where I see the boot line being, because I know I'm going to have a boot coming up here to cover part of this. Now, one thing that's important to remember whenever you're sculpting a leg or an arm for that matter is, and a sculptor, very, very well-known sculptor, friend of mine, Joe Burton, when I first met him, he had some constructive criticism for me, and one of the things he pointed out was really be careful to accentuate the fact that these guys have all got elbows and they've all got knees. You got to be really careful when you're doing a figure that the knee joint doesn't look like that. Knees, they're a point. They come to a little bit of a point, and you got to make sure that you don't lose that. When you got a guy with a bent elbow, his elbow isn't like that. It's an elbow. Make sure you find where the elbow is, and make sure if you don't want it to be really pointy, make sure you got a good reason for that. But nothing's worse than looking. If you're not careful, you can make your figures look like Gumby. I mean, literally.
Everybody's in the down jacket.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a lot of like funky looking, shapes there where you want to make sure that you can see that there's a body under these clothes. That it's not just you're not just putting some big rubber suit on the guy. So
The shaping is almost entirely rolling, isn't it, rather than pulling or pushing?
it is, yeah, and a lot of this, you're essentially, yeah, it's exactly right. It's a rolling motion, and I'm not sure when I really got into using that motion. Maybe it was just a kind of the necessity being the mother of invention. But yeah, it's really it's a very nice way to keep. To move the putty around without disrupting where it is too much.
Otherwise, you tear it off.
Otherwise, you could tear it off. Yeah. Okay. Now I haven't really sculpted any. There are some areas here and there where I probably would use a brush to smooth this out a little bit. So you'll notice that when I pass this around. Now, before I've really done any folds or wrinkles in this guy. Now, keep in mind something else. don't spend a lot of time sculpting things people aren't going to see. I mean, really. You know, I could do the top of his pants. You know, I could do nice buttons on them. You know, I could even sculpt in little bits of stitching around the top of the belt line, all that. I could put some suspenders and all that, but you're not going to see any of it when you put the sack coat over the top of it and everything else. So don't spend a lot of time with things that aren't going to be visible. So when you're sculpting, you're always thinking of layering on clothing from the inside out. So the things that are going to be underneath you're doing first, and the things that are going to be outside, common sense. And in this case, the trousers are going to be on, the coat's going to go over the top of it. So it stands to reason it makes a lot more sense to do the trousers first, coat last, so on and so forth. So I'm going to pass that around. Just kind of hold him by the shoulders or the head, because there's nothing wet there. Just give you an idea of just the shape of the putty. Now that's probably a pretty good basic shape for those trousers. Again, there's no detailing yet for the wrinkles and the folds and everything else. I'm going to do that here in a minute. I just want to get an idea of what it looks like, just to get all that on there. Because again, one of the most common mistakes sculptors who are just learning make is they tend to just overdo it. They either just put way too much putty on, and then they're scraping it off, and it all gets messed up, or they're just not putting enough on, and they're not quite sure whether or not they need more, and they just keep spreading it farther and farther and farther, and pretty soon it.
To figure out where you want to put the folds, did you study, pick photographs?
You know, I'm going to brag a little bit about that for a second. At the Boston Expo back in 2003, I met Don Troiani for the first time, and he was a big idol of mine. So, and he actually had seen my models too, which was pretty cool. So we were talking together, and he's a really nice guy. And he was asking me, and I was saying, you know, do you actually get guys all dressed up in these uniforms and you photograph? And he said, yeah, because how else can I know how the wrinkles are? And he said, well, you got to do that too with your models, don't you? And I said, no, I don't. I could try to get my wife and daughters to dress up in Civil War clothes, but I don't. I think they might do it once out of amusement, but after that, they'd probably tell me where to go. So, I said, well, how